listening to CMDA Matters, the weekly podcast of Christian Medical and Dental Associations. Here's your host, Dr. Mike Chupp.
Well, hey, friends of CMDA. It is great to be back with you on CMDA Matters this week. I've been in Italy with my wife, Pam, for the last 2 weeks, helping to lead a group of 34 CMDA members and spouses, as well as friends, walking the Appian Way, a more than 2,000-year-old road that the Apostle Paul took and the good Dr. Luke wrote about in Acts chapter 28. And, parts of this 120-mile road from the southwest coast of Italy all the way up to Rome are still intact today, and they're featured in several Italian cities. I do want to thank Pastor Bert Jones for covering for me while I was gone and presenting a couple of episodes to you. I want to tell you one of my highlights that when we as a team, a touring group, got to Rome was standing and singing Amazing Grace with our touring group in a beautiful church that was built a very long time ago over the place where church tradition tells us that Paul was under house arrest for 2 years in Rome. The Apostle Paul, who preached and wrote so powerfully about God's grace earlier in his ministry, he told the church in Corinth, "But by the grace of God, I am what I am, and his grace to me was not without effect. No, I worked harder than all of them, yet not I, but the grace of God that was with me." We also visited the church that has been built on the site where Paul was beheaded by order of Nero. Today in Rome, most statues or paintings of the Apostle Paul, and we saw many of them over the last couple of weeks, they show him with a sword in his hand. I didn't realize that that's how the early church remembered the beloved Paul. I can't help but think that this image of the last, and in his own words, least of the apostles, comes from Ephesians 6 and Paul's description of the armor of God, including our victorious weapon of choice, the sword of the Spirit, the Word of God. Friends, if you've never been on a CMDA biblical tour, we have many excellent choices for you and your spouse or your friends, including a 7 Churches of Revelation tour in Turkey that's next spring, led by a biblical scholar whom I got to meet in Italy, who's also a 20-year veteran missionary in Turkey, Professor Mark Wilson. If you'd like to learn more about that tour that's coming and others next year, just go to cmda.org/events. Well, I'm back and we have an important conversation to share with you this week. Dr. Jeff Barrows and I were joined by Dr. Ben Frush, who recently co-wrote an article with one of our past convention speakers from the University of Michigan, Dr. Kristen Collier, about the importance of moral diversity in healthcare training. We invited Ben to join us on the podcast to take a deep dive into this topic about moral diversity. So keep on listening, and you're going to hear more of our conversation with young bioethicist Dr. Ben Frush. Well, today on CMDA Matters, I am delighted to welcome my frequent co-host, Dr. Jeff Barrows, our Senior Vice President of Bioethics and Public Policy. We've got a scholarly, well-published guest today from Duke, who's currently working at Georgetown as a McDonald Agape Fellow in Bioethics at the Kennedy Institute for Ethics at Georgetown. Dr. Benjamin Frush completed medical school at UNC Chapel Hill and actually is a former fellow at the Theology, Medicine, and Culture Fellowship there at Duke Divinity School. He then went on to do a Med-Peds residency and chief residency at Vanderbilt. And then after that, more training in a palliative care fellowship at UNC Chapel Hill again. So you came full circle there, I think, Dr. Frush.
That's right. Lots of training.
Well, we got introduced to you through a friend of CMDA who spoke at our national convention in Cincinnati, Dr. Kristen Collier. She shared with me an article that she had co-written, co-published with you entitled Moral Diversity for Medical Trainees. And you were arguing for the inclusion of moral diversity as a part of the universal DEI efforts that seem to be present, maybe not popular in every sphere, but those efforts. You were arguing that to think about diversity in one more facet in terms of morality. But just so our listeners know, you were telling me earlier how many articles that you've published. Tell our listeners that you've been around the block a few times in the journal world.
Well, first, just let me say thank you for the opportunity to join you all. I think it's important for us to reason together as Christians in healthcare, and I'm grateful for this opportunity. As far as writing and publishing, it's really something that I've taken as a way of processing the moral experience of medical training, as a way to get thoughts down and try to gain clarity, both as a Christian and as a physician. So I don't know the exact number of essays I've published. I think it's in the 40 to 50 range, but it's really more a cathartic experience for me than anything else. And just a way to try to gain clarity on a lot of the things I experience intuitively that bear further reflection.
Why don't you tell us I'd never heard of moral diversity, honestly. And so when I saw the title of the paper that you wrote with Dr. Collier, could you tell us all, what do you actually mean by that term?
In the essay Kristen and I wrote, we draw on the thought of a philosopher named Patricia Marino, who writes about ethical pluralism and this idea of moral diversity, which basically refers to a variety of differing viewpoints on important moral or ethical issues. I think a central tenet of the idea of moral diversity is that it's not just that there are different viewpoints, it's that oftentimes these beliefs or viewpoints are incompatible and mutually exclusive, and thus naturally entail disagreement. And another element of moral diversity, as we understand it and describe it in this piece, is that it deals with consequential beliefs or moral ideals, what the philosopher Charles Taylor would refer to as strong evaluation. So issues of ultimate categorical importance. So not just differing viewpoints where people, sort of agree to disagree and don't think much of it, but actually beliefs and moral ideals that individuals hold most dear and oftentimes, overtly state that they're not in agreement with their interlocutors.
Well, Dr. Frush, you characterize the moral and ethical environment of, I think correctly so, the vast majority of medical education programs across the country as working within the ethical framework that many of us know as principlism. But I think there are many of our listeners that may not be familiar with that term. So could you briefly define what constitutes principlism, and then help us understand how that framework limits moral diversity, especially within medical education?
So principlism is admittedly challenging to define succinctly, but the overview I will give of the system of thought is that it's an ethical framework that was originally published in the literature, I think in 1979, the late 70s, by Tom Beecham and Jim Childress. I think the latter is a theologian. Beecham, I think, is a philosopher, if I'm not mistaken. Basically, a way to try to approach the problem of pluralism within medical ethics, namely the idea there are different ways that individuals understand medical and ethical decision-making, different traditions that they draw from. So how can one approach these issues in a fashion that is not explicitly dependent on a specific moral tradition in order to avoid the disagreement that might prevent mutual progress forward on these issues. So principlism entails the four central principles delineated by Beecham and Childress, those being the principles of beneficence, non-maleficence, justice, and respect for autonomy. And the idea is this system of thinking is especially germane when trying to resolve ethical dilemmas that arise. And basically, individuals should harness these principles and the specific ethical context to try to arrive at a solution that can, at least in theory, resolve this ethical disagreement. So there's been a lot of ink spilled about principlism and this approach to ethics. I think some of the criticism is probably excessive, though I do harbor reservations as to its efficacy and legitimacy. The main point that Kristen and I attempt to draw out in our essay is the belief found in a principle-based approach that the moral reasoning or insights of specific moral traditions are viewed as out of bounds within the scope of the hospital or the clinic or the medical school, and that people can only speak in the language of these somewhat generic principles rather than attempting to draw on specific traditions, whether they be religious or ethical in nature, to try to think about what the best course of action might be in medicine. And we argue, the principle-based approach is really the default approach that's universally harnessed in Western medicine. It's taught in medical ethics courses, it's on the USMLE exams. And so what we argue is this belief in the kind of supposed common ethical rationality of these principles that are not explicitly embedded within a tradition inculcates this idea in trainees and medical students that specific moral traditions are out of bounds in the course of their medical reasoning, and thus are not sort of welcome at the table, and thus can work against what we term like the moral diversity that's important for progressing thought and action in medicine.
Dr. Frush, you set up in the article what is obvious to anyone who's been through any sort of postgraduate medical training or dental training, and that is there's this power differential. You've got consultants or attendings, if you will, and residents and interns, and then you have students. And while Dr. Barrows and I would love to encourage and equip our students to be courageous, we also face the realities that for students to get through their training, to buck the system, would take a tremendous amount of courage, and many advisors would say, don't do it, or else you're going to risk your career. Paradoxically, it seems like maybe some of the more secular students, like what happened with Dr. Collier at the University of Michigan, the great white coat walkout, are very, very aggressive and willing to state their points. But would you just unpack that just a little bit for our listeners about this moral distress that's going to come from them understanding, I just don't believe in this, but what else can I do?
Yeah, it's a really germane question in our cultural moment, and something I'm keenly aware of. I'm still a trainee, albeit in ethics rather than clinically right now. So it's a question I've grappled with for the better part of the last decade in medical school, residency, and fellowship. So I think the place to begin is properly construing or understanding the nature of medicine itself and what that entails for medical training. So the common way I think medical students are taught to think of medical school and residency training is really the process of information inculcation, technical honing. But I follow folks like Warren Kinghorn at Duke who really argue, and Farr Curlin, another mentor at Duke, who argue that medicine is fundamentally and primarily a moral enterprise rather than something that's technical in nature. And this line of thinking predates even Christian iterations. You can trace it back to Aristotle and the Hippocratic line of thinking. So medicine deals with real goods like health and flourishing, relief of suffering. It requires virtues, right, which are not neutral, but are oriented towards the good and its practitioners. Therefore, I think the way to think about medical training and education is a process, and Kinghorn and Brewer-Eberle both write about this as moral formation, as learning to become a certain type of person who pursues the good and directs others in that vein. And so when we think about the challenges of medical training and how they bear on conscience and moral distress, you made a point that I think is worth repeating, that in a culture that's increasingly suspicious of hierarchy and institutions, it seems to me that medicine, along with perhaps only the military, is a place where that staunch hierarchy is preserved, and there is a real momentum to fall in line in accordance with one's superiors. So it naturally is the case that medicine is primarily understood as something that's moral in nature, and there's a hierarchy present that can urge trainees and people in places of relative disempowerment to act in ways that they deem inappropriate, wrong, not fitting. It can entail this idea of moral distress. I think moral distress, it's a term that has been taken up by the literature the last 5 or 6 years in particular. Oftentimes, as I see it, it's used not specifically and kind of more generally. And it's an idea that arises out of the literature of veterans returning from war and nursing literature, and refers to the idea that one is precluded from acting in a way that one deems fitting by systematic or bureaucratic elements. And I think that this is something that trainees and medical students, it's sort of ironic that I think the more one comes to understand the moral weight of practice, the more one, I think, is predisposed to that type of moral injury or moral distress. And I think these pressures internal to medicine are really compounded in this cultural moment by a broader hesitancy to speak robustly on moral issues for a fear that one might be, canceled or maligned. You mentioned the white coat ceremony. And I think our current generation of medical students and trainees are hyper aware of that. So I think all of these factors, both internal to the practice of medicine as something moral, and externally the sort of heightened attention to voicing a viewpoint that might be in opposition, conspire to create an environment that is quite challenging for medical students and trainees. But I think is all the more reason we need to encourage an environment that allows people in places of relative disempowerment to voice their viewpoints on these matters and to act in ways in accordance with well thought out and delineated beliefs about the good of medicine and the patients that we serve.
Yeah, and I'm glad you've brought up in this article the whole topic of moral distress. And for our listeners who may not be aware, the Ethics Committee and then the Board and House of Representatives have approved, and we've released a position statement a couple of years ago that deals in fairly great depth on the issue of moral distress and moral injury. So that's a resource for our listeners in case they're interested in going a little bit further. But Ben, to me, the strengths of this article was your discussion on conscience. In it, you and Kristen emphasize the importance of conscience in medicine or medical trainees. And let me quote you. You detail how the exercise of conscience is central to preserving the integrity of medical practice. And so that's quite a statement. And I'm glad to see that. I fully agree. But just let me ask you, how would you define conscience? And then how do you see that it is in fact, central to preserving the integrity of medicine?
This is another great question, and one that would take a book to respond to adequately, but I'll do my best. So as to the way that Kristen and I define and understand conscience in this piece and more broadly, I guess where I should start actually is, I think conscience is a word that today engenders strong feelings, namely because the primary way, at least across medical education ethics spaces, that conscience is invoked is in the context of conscientious objection, which I think is important and something, we need to think hard about. But the point that Kristen and I try to make in the piece, and we stand on the shoulders of great thinkers in this area. I mentioned Farr Curlin. Dan Sulmazy at Georgetown has written extensively on the idea of conscience in medicine. Conscience is not something that only arises when there's an ethical dilemma or disagreement at play. Conscience is a primary faculty of moral reasoning. We draw on a physician named J.T. Berger in our piece, who defined conscience as the capacity of the human to make decisions consistent with a good and honorable life for oneself and others, which I think is a good definition. I want to also quote Dan Sulmazy, who's a philosopher and internist at Georgetown, in a piece he's written on conscience, which I would commend to folks who'd like to learn more. But he describes conscience as a commitment to uphold one's deepest self-identifying moral beliefs a commitment to discern the moral features of particular cases as best one can, and to reason morally to the best of one's ability, a commitment to emotional balance in one's moral decision-making, to being neither too hard nor too soft, a commitment to make decisions according to the best of one's moral ability, and to act upon what one discerns to be the morally right course of action. So a lot of moral in that definition.
Before we continue with this week's episode, here's a special announcement for you. Have you encountered a difficult patient care decision at your hospital? Do you have a question about how to maintain Hippocratic traditions within your work as a healthcare professional? We know our members are looking for resources on today's top bioethical issues, and we're here to help. CMDA's Ethics Hotline is an on-call program assisting members who are facing these difficult patient care decisions or questions. The hotline is provided by a panel of Christian ethicists who also formulate CMDA's ethical position statements that are based on scientific, moral, and biblical principles. You can reach the hotline by calling 423-844-1000 or by visiting cmda.org/ethics. As a result of a partnership between CMDA and Alliance Defending Freedom, we are now offering free legal consultations for CMDA members who may be experiencing conscience freedom issues in the workplace. Exclusively available to CMDA members, this program is designed to serve members who feel they are being discriminated against in the workplace due to their firmly held moral and religious beliefs. If you feel your conscience freedoms are at risk, please visit cmda.org/legal to learn more about how we can help. Let's jump right back into this week's episode.
I think the way that we need to think about conscience is this faculty that allows one, to the best of one's ability, to discern the salient moral features at play and to determine what a right course of action is, to allow action in accordance with that determination. There is a lot of overlap in the way that, both Aristotle and St. Thomas talk about the virtue of practical reason or prudence in the way that we think about conscience. So all that is sort of setting the table, I think, to make a few important points about conscience and how it bears on medical practice today. First, insofar as medicine is a primarily moral practice, as I've argued earlier, it's impossible for one to practice without the use of conscience. Moral discernment is crucial, even in the most sort of banal quotidian decisions we make about treating community-acquired pneumonia, right? We determine that it's better for patients to receive treatment than to try to fend for their own. And at its heart, that's not merely a clinical decision, but a moral one. So even folks who would malign the idea of conscience draw on their own sort of moral calculus and conscientious decision-making. I think, that philosophical underpinning is important, but sometimes can cause people to sort of their eyes to glaze over and not appreciate kind of the practicality of it. So a few things I want to just make explicit is the way that I think conscience is misunderstood in medicine and maybe society more broadly. So conscience is not merely a personal or idiosyncratic intuitive way of thinking about things. Traditional understandings of conscience argue that it is informed by communal practical reasoning and moral tradition, and it's something that should be shared, should be explicated. Somebody should not just invoke conscience as a conversation stopper and say, my conscience prevents me from doing this. They should, be obligated to explain how they think about the situation and what their reasoning is. So it's an invitation for further conversation rather than a conversation stopper. It's not something that's idiosyncratic and irrational. Fundamentally, conscience is something that should allow one to try to convey clearly their reasoning in a way that at its best can, potentially persuade those with whom one disagrees about why they think the right course of action is what it is. So, in sum, I think conscience is a primary faculty of all humans. It's central to the practice of medicine, as medicine is an inherently moral practice and requires conscience no matter what the content of one's conscientious beliefs are. And I think it should invite us to further conversation and potentially moral disagreement rather than be used as a conversation stopper.
Ben, a very dear friend of mine and a former trustee of CMDA, who was also for a while the chair of the American Board of Surgery, is Dr. John Mellinger, who's now retired. But after the Dobbs decision last year, he actually, at the request of a couple of bioethicist friends of his, knowing his influence within academia, he wrote an editorial to a prominent medical journal and said, from my perspective, 75 medical societies had all released statements after Dobbs condemning Dobbs. And Dr. Mellinger's point in the editorial, which was outright rejected within 24 hours, it was refused to be published, in which he challenged the societies to nuance in the discussion, recognizing that a Gallup poll shows that 39% of Americans identify as pro-life and that there is no other minority demographic that all these societies would ever just say no to, not any other demographic, so that there should have been some nuance in these positions in response to Dobbs, that there's a Hippocratic tradition, that there's an understanding of sanctity of life, So outright just ignored. So in that setting, with such a strong society pushback on this issue, how in the world are our medical trainees going to have a chance on some of these issues to be able to push back and there to be this moral diversity? Are there any rays of light that you have seen recently that show to you and Dr. Collier and others that want to see this moral diversity, that there's going to be some, I think it's Hume or Haidt, one of those two, who talked about someone finally comes along and knocks an idol off the pedestal. And right now it seems that abortion is an idol within the American medical sphere.
I fully recognize that abortion is an issue that stirs up the most strong and passionate of feelings, and there's a variety of viewpoints on it, right? It seems to me that from the way you're describing it, that it is a travesty that from Dr. Mellinger, a position that would say, we need to talk about this and understand that there's a plurality, there are a variety of ways one understands this, both from the lay public and from those within medicine. It seems to me just, I don't know how else to put it, wrong. Unfortunate seems too soft a term to not allow for that position, because how else does one sort of hope to move forward with, collective moral and practical reasoning other than recognizing there's a diversity of views on this issue and allowing space at the table to voice those? So that just seems to me to be a really unfortunate and wrong decision not to allow for that viewpoint, particularly when, and I haven't read it myself, but if it's, well reasoned and charitable, I see no justification for not wanting to engage in that conversation. The question of, you mentioned the word hope and light. The first thing I'll say is I think these issues are crucial to discuss and consider at an institutional, a legal level for organizations like CMDA. It's important we have leaders talk about this and think about the legal implications and how they bear upon, medical practice. I will say that throughout my time in training, something I credit my friend and co-author on some pieces, Brewer Eberly, who's a family medicine physician and fellow TMC graduate, for this. I've just become more and more convinced of the role of aesthetics in how we think and convince other people. I think logic is compelling and central to what we believe as Christians, right? As truth, as Christ has embodied truth. But it doesn't stand apart from, and in fact is consonant with, beauty. And so what I have found in my practice, and I'm not holding myself up as a moral exemplar or an instantiation of beauty by any stretch, but when one tries to embody a form of practice that is predicated upon and recognizes Christ's injunction to offer hospitality to the stranger and to care for the least of these, and one is thoughtful about that as a Christian, I do think it is a radical statement in a medical culture that I'm not trying to malign as like bad. I think it's good in many ways, but oftentimes doesn't leave the time and thought and reflection to allow for that type of practice. So when one practices in a way that is charitable towards students and trainees, that treats one's coworkers, nurses with respect, that seeks to advocate courageously for patients, I think it encourages and invites a type of reflection and a form of respect among one's co-practitioners that allows for kind of a legitimacy in speaking about moral matters that otherwise is absent. So I think that these conversations, especially for most trainees or practitioners who are listening, who aren't going to be people who function as leaders of organizations, and that, again, role is crucial for people who are, as you use the term, in the trenches every day. I think if we learn to embody a Christian ethic that seriously seeks to follow Christ in a way that, I take to be radical in medical training and practice, that allows us the reputational sort of currency, for lack of a better term, to make arguments that are compelling with people who trust us. And I believe that these arguments cannot be made in the absence of relationship. And when that relationship is Christ-like in nature, it opens up all sorts of avenues of a melding of truth and beauty. But again, I just want to say, I do think this is not to abdicate the role of institutional and organizational responsibility in trying to think clearly and speak about these matters as Dr. Mellinger did. It's just, I think, as individual practitioners in our daily vocation, I do see a great opportunity as a way to sort of enter into these conversations when we gain credence by our daily actions and charity towards one another.
We're running out of time. So I want to finish with a question. You talk about the virtues in your article, the virtues of humility, tolerance, and compassion, and how critical those are for moral diversity to be at work in the healthcare public square. So from what you've experienced up to this point in your career, would the House of Medicine right now, 2024, agree today that those three virtues are A, at the top of the list of the most needed virtues, like you say they are, and B, that they're in short supply, as you've stated?
I think that if you polled people across medicine and said, are the virtues of tolerance, humility, and compassion important for medicine, you'd get probably unanimous people saying yes. That having been said, in the way that medicine plays out, and I think winsome is a good word. I actually hold a high view of medicine and medical training. I really enjoyed it by and large. I think there's inherent good in it, and I've seen beauty and courage in the people I've trained alongside. But I don't think we always live out what most would probably say in medicine is the importance of those virtues. So humility, first of all, I don't think that humility, particularly like epistemic humility, is something that is encouraged in the course of our training. There's been a lot written, as you'll probably know, about this idea of the hidden curriculum in medicine that sort of countervails our explicit goals of trying to be good, sound, and virtuous practitioners, and in fact sort of trains people in the opposite direction subtly and implicitly, but powerfully. I don't think that we're taught to be especially humble. I think that we're taught to be definitive, and that we are not taught to think about uncertainty well, and that ultimately the buck stops with us as physicians specifically. Tolerance, again, I don't think that the idea of disagreement is something that has had much philosophical or ethical exploration within medicine. I think it's basically, what can we agree on is the best scientific response to this problem, and what's the most efficient way to enact it, rather than how can we recognize the inherent uncertainty in the work that we do, especially given its moral nature, and how do we navigate that in a way that's respectful and thoughtful. And compassion, suffering with, as it's literally translated, clearly a Christian virtue, what Christ did with us, right? And I think central to the role of a physician. But I think there are many ways that contemporary training and medical education can short circuit compassion as a virtue. And it's something that we need role models for, kind of moral exemplars to show us how to be with patients in a way that is thoughtful, that is charitable, that is open, and that is patient. And to be quite frank, I think it requires a moral community that's outside of medicine. I think it requires the virtue and tradition of it. It doesn't have to be Christianity. As a Christian, I believe Christianity is uniquely suited to answer these questions. But I think medical trainees if they don't have sort of a robust moral and ethical framework and understanding of the true, the good, and the beautiful, will struggle to learn these virtues and to embody them in the course of their everyday practice.
Well, Dr. Frush, you have shared with us some really important insights today, and I'm just thinking about this title that you currently have, and it's got my mind racing, McDonald Agape Fellow. And I'd never known that there was an Agape Fellow, but I kind of feel like all of our listeners, CMDA members, and others would want to be an Agape Fellow, a fellow of God's, working on learning how to do God's love better, right where we're practicing. So I want to thank you for taking the time out today to join us, and it's given us some great food for thought, and we'll have a link in our show notes today to this article that you and Dr. Collier wrote, and so we wish you Godspeed. I know that you're at the beginning of this 2-year Agape Fellowship there at Georgetown. So God bless you, and we'll look for more good stuff coming from your corner.
Well, I want to thank you both again for your time and the opportunity. Like I said, just in closing, I believe, we are called to follow Christ in our daily individual vocation, right? But I also believe in the importance of institutions like CMDA to address these questions at a broader societal level and to embody that idea of winsomeness and charity, and particularly for those we might disagree with. So I'm grateful for the work that you all do and grateful to be a part of thinking collectively with you. There are no easy answers to these questions, but the way we move forward, I think, is collective discernment, ultimately guided by, our faith in Christ as the embodiment of the true, the good, and the beautiful. So thank you all again.
I appreciate the foundational quote that Dr. Frush shared with us during our conversation when we were talking about conscience. He said, "Conscience is the primary faculty of moral reasoning." Well, conscience freedom is really an important issue for us here at CMDA, and it undergirds so much of the discussions that we have regarding other ethical issues. I really hope that this conversation with Dr. Frush made you curious about the article that he co-wrote with Dr. Kristen Collier. We've actually included a link in our show notes for you today, so I encourage you to read it and explore this topic more with us. And before I forget, I also want to give you a few more details about the Theology, Medicine, and Culture initiative at Duke Divinity School, which Dr. Frush talked about. The TMC Fellowship offers an immersive 1 or 2-year residential experience as it equips participants for a lifetime of wise and faithful healing work. The fellowship is open to current and future students and practitioners in any of the health professions, as well as to others whose vocations involve full-time work in health-related contexts, for example, public health workers or chaplains and hospital administrators. If you'd like more information, just visit tmc.divinity.duke.edu, or you can find that very link in our show notes. I do have 3 specific resources today, friends, that I want to share with you that specifically relate to our conversation with Dr. Frush. The first is Dr. Farr Curlin's book, The Way of Medicine, which he co-wrote with Dr. Christopher Tollefson. And Farr was actually one of our plenary speakers at our national convention earlier this year. In this book, they ask the questions, what is medicine? And what is it for? What does it even mean to be a good doctor? Answers to these questions, well, they're quite essential, both to the practice of medicine and to our understanding of the moral norms that shape that practice. The authors call for practitioners to recover what they call the way of medicine, which offers physicians the moral resources necessary to resist the various political or institutional, as well as cultural forces that constantly are pushing practitioners and patients into thinking that their relationship is in terms of an economic exchange. You can purchase your copy today in the CMDA bookstore by going to cmda.org/bookstore. bookstore. The second resource I'd like to mention is a new curriculum developed by CMDA's advocacy team and Dr. Jeff Barrows. Here at CMDA, we know the importance of introducing students and residents earlier in their training to these topics, like conscience freedoms and abortion. And that's why we created the newest addition to CMDA's long list of resources for our members and constituents. It is specifically for students and residents, called Standing Strong in Training. This new curriculum helps healthcare students as well as residents stand up against the pervasive cultural pressures that are facing Christians within healthcare right now. The curriculum's 7 modules are designed for group settings, allowing attendees to solidify their foundational worldview beliefs regarding important issues, such as those at the beginning of life, at the end of life, and biblical sexuality. Each module also offers ideas of how to winsomely defend biblical values and positively interact with others in developing their worldview beliefs. For more information and to download this free resource, just visit cmda.org/standingstrong. And the final resource that I want to mention is the position statement that we have at CMDA on moral distress and moral injury in healthcare. And we mentioned that during our conversation with Ben Frush today. This is one of a very large group of statements that have been designed to provide you in healthcare with biblical, ethical, social, and scientific understanding of a variety of bioethical issues through concise statements that have been articulated in a compassionate and caring manner. Our CMDA Ethics Committee spends an incredible amount of time and energy researching and crafting each of these statements. Because, friends, we place so much value on providing these as resources for our members. You can find this statement on moral diversity and moral injury, along with 70 or 80 other position statements, by going to cmda.org/ethics. I hope that you'll join me next Thursday for a conversation with a couple of innovative physicians who have developed a platform specifically for healthcare missionaries around the world that is taken care of and offered by medical specialists in the U.S. to help consult on very difficult, specific clinical matters. It's a great resource for those who are working on the mission field in a very creative way for a broad array of specialists to serve and support them from their homes or offices. So be sure to listen in. As we close, let me share a recent testimony that we received from a second-year CMDA student who said, quote, "CMDA has continued to keep me grounded and has encouraged me in difficulties that I've experienced being a medical student in an ever-growing secular world. Our conversations are stimulating, and they always redirect my heart and mind toward Christ." Conversations like today's episode with Dr. Ben Frush are helping to keep students and residents and other healthcare professionals to keep them grounded and encouraged in Christ's Word, in spite of the difficulties of our ever-growing secular world. I hope, friends, that CMDA Matters continues to be a resource that keeps you grounded and encouraged in your walk with our Lord Jesus and in your training as well as your work in healthcare. And I pray that it's helping encourage you to bring the hope and healing of Jesus Christ to the world. That's what matters to CMDA, friends. And CMDA matters. I want to take the time to thank our podcast production team, including Mandy Morin, who sets up all the interviews and helps me with these transition scripts, as well as Rusty Sluter, our sound technician, and then Mrs. Jamie Majeski, who's the voice to keep you informed of what's happening right now and in the future at CMDA. We'll see you next week, God willing.
Thanks for listening to CMDA Matters. If you would like to suggest a future guest or share a comment with us, please email cmdamatters@cmda.org. And if you like the podcast, be sure to give us a 5-star rating and share it on your favorite social media platform. This podcast has been a production of Christian Medical and Dental Associations. The opinions expressed by guests on this podcast are not necessarily endorsed by Christian Medical and Dental Associations. CMDA is a nonpartisan organization that does not endorse political parties or candidates for public office. The views expressed on this podcast reflect judgments regarding principles and values held by CMDA and its members, and are not intended to imply endorsement of any political party or candidate.